Good day and welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe. My name is Rob Cloney and I'm joining you here from Montreal in the province of Quebec in the country of Canada. This is the traditional unceded territory, the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people and the Anishinaabe Algonquian peoples. Having lived these past few months in the world of COVID-19 has been really difficult. Most of us have been locked away, isolated from our friends and family, and it's been very difficult. On the other hand, I've had the opportunity to meet great people from around the world, storytellers who've had the opportunity to come to us virtually in Montreal and share stories with us, and we in turn have been able to go and attend events in some of their places. So if you're looking for a silver lining, it's this: new stories, new friends, and hopefully after all this passes, we'll get to continue this tradition. Of course, it's always nice to tell a story live, but on the other hand, it's always nice to reach new audiences and always to make new friends. I thought that since I'm coming to you from Canada, and I know a large part of the audience is on the European and Asian continents, I would share some stories that have been passed down through Canada's history. Some of them may be known to you, and some of them may not be known to you, but I hope you enjoy them. The first one I'm going to tell you comes from the French tradition and usually has a character by the name of Ti-Jean, who is kind of a wise fool character. Years ago, I adapted this to a more Celtic maritime character. I'm from the maritime region of Canada, and so the character's name has changed. And this character's name is Biggie Gallagher. Now, the only thing you need to know about Biggie Gallagher is that he's a lot like a knife. He's sharp on one side, dull on the other, and you never know which side you're going to get. Well, this story begins one morning when Biggie wakes up, and he turns to his wife and he says, "What's for breakfast?" She said, "Nothing." He said, "What do you mean, nothing?" She said, "Biggie, you lost your job. We've no food in the pantry, no money in our pockets. So unless you plan to sell that milking cow of yours, there's nothing for breakfast." Well, you can imagine with a name like Biggie Gallagher, he wasn't interested in going without breakfast. So 5 minutes later, he was out in the yard putting a rope around that cow's neck, and off they went into town. He wasn't on that road very long. And who should he run into but the town's mayor? And the mayor said, "Good morning, Mr. Gallagher. How are you today?" Biggie said, "Well, Your Honor," he said, "I don't know if you heard," he said, "but I lost my job. And the wife told me if I didn't sell this here cow, well, I wasn't going to have anything for breakfast." "Biggie, you're selling your prize-winning milker? How much do you want for her?" Biggie said, "Oh, I don't know, $50. "Sold, Biggie. But Biggie, I'm on my way to see some constituents. I'm going to need you to take it home for me. Could you do that?" Biggie said, "No problem. I'll take it home for you." So he put the $50 in his pocket and down the road he went. Couldn't have been 5 minutes later. And who should he bump into but the town's doctor? The doctor said, "Good morning, Biggie. How are you today?" He said, "Well, Doc," he said, "I don't know if you heard," he said, "but I lost my job. And the wife told me if I didn't sell this here cow, I wasn't going to have anything for breakfast." "Sell your prize-winning milker?" I said, "Biggie, what's a cow like that go for?" "Oh, $50. "Sold, Biggie." "Well, hold on, Doc. Biggie, you named your price. Let's not negotiate. Here's $50. But I'm on my way to see some patients, so I'm going to need you to take it home for me. Could you do that for me, Biggie?" He said, "Sure, no problem." Down the road he went. Well, you know it wasn't 5 minutes later when he bumped into yet another person. This time, it was the parish priest. He said, "Mr. Gallagher, how are you today?" He said, "Well, Father," he said, "I don't know if you heard," he said, "but I lost my job. And, well, the wife told me if I didn't sell this here cow, I wasn't going to have anything for breakfast." "Sell your prize milker?" said, Biggie, what's a cow like that go for? Biggie said, well, most people are paying $50. Biggie, sold. We need one over at the parish house. But I'm on my way to seeing some parishioners. I'm going to need you to take it home for me. Could you do that for me, Biggie? He said, sure. So another $50 in his pocket. How much does he have now? $150. And he's heading down the road with that cow. Well, within 10 minutes, he was back in his own yard. And there was his wife, Margaret, Maggie, they call her, out in the yard. And Maggie says, Biggie, what are you doing home so soon? And why do you still have that cow? He said, you're not going to believe this. He said, I sold that cow to 3 different people, $50 each. I got $150 in my pocket, and I still have the cow. She said, Biggie, you can't do that. You can't sell the same cow to 3 different people. You're going to get in some trouble. We need some legal help. Well, they contacted the town lawyer, and he came out. Now, he knew the kind of foolishness that Biggie could get into. And when he heard the story, he just laughed. Well, when he got over his chuckle, he said, Biggie, Maggie's right. They're coming for you. They're going to want that cow, or they're going to want their money. But I think I can help you. But you're going to have to do exactly what I tell you to do. Biggie said, you tell me what to do. He said, I'll do it. Well, he said, when they come in, they're going to ask you something, some question. Whenever they speak to you, this is what I want you to reply. Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee, diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee-dee-dum. Can you do that, Biggie? Biggie said, I can do that, no problem. Well, the next morning, there was the lawyer at Biggie's house. So it was he who opened the door when the first knock came. Who do you think it was? It was the mayor. Oh, the mayor was upset. He said, lawyer, thank goodness you're here. He said, Biggie Gallagher sold me a cow for $50 and he didn't deliver the cow and he still has my money. I want the cow or the money right now. The lawyer said, Your Honor, he said, thank goodness you're here. There's something wrong with Biggie. Maybe you could speak to him. Well, just then, Biggie walked into the room. And the mayor couldn't help himself. He said, Biggie, where's my cow? Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee, diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee-dee-dum. Well, when the mayor heard that, he thought, what would people think of me taking $50 from a man who's clearly not well? He turned to the lawyer. He said, listen, you tell Biggie not to worry about the cow, not to worry about the $50, but don't you tell a soul I was here. And out the door he went. Well, couldn't have been. 5 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. And when the lawyer opened that door, there was the doctor. He said, lawyer, you're here. He said, where's Biggie Gallagher? He took $50 from me for a cow, and I want that cow right now, or I want my $50 back. The lawyer said, Doc, thank goodness you're here. He said, there's something wrong with Biggie. Maybe you could talk to him. You're a medical man. Well, just then, Biggie walked into the room. The doctor said, Biggie, where's my cow? Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee. Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee-dee-dum. Well, when the doctor heard that, he thought, what would people think of me taking money from a man who's clearly not well? And what's worse, he's got a condition of the head. He said, I'm a doctor of the body. He said, I don't know how to deal with this. And what if people think I caused it? No. He turned to the lawyer. He said, listen, you tell Biggie not to worry about the $50 and not to worry about the cow. But don't you tell a soul I was here. And out the door he went. Well, couldn't have been. 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. And who do you think it was? Town's priest. Priest says, lawyer. He said, where's Biggie Gallagher? Imagine him taking advantage of the church like that. He sold me a cow for $50. He was supposed to deliver it, and he didn't. And I want the cow or the money right now. The lawyer said, well, Father, he said, thank goodness you're here. You're a man of the cloth. He said, there's something wrong with Biggie. Maybe you could speak to him. Well, just then, Biggie walked into the room. The priest said, "Biggie, where's my cow?" Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee. Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee-dee-dum. Well, when the priest heard that, he thought, how can I take money from a man who's clearly not well? What would people think? Nobody come to church anymore. He turned to the lawyer. He said, you tell Biggie to keep that cow and the money, and don't you tell a soul I was here. Tell him I'm praying for him. And out the door he went. Well, no sooner had that door shut, the lawyer fell on his knees, laughing. Margaret came into the room laughing, and even Biggie began to chuckle a little bit. The lawyer said, you know it was my plan, he said, but there was no way I thought that was going to work. Biggie said, I have to tell you, I had my doubts too, he said, but it worked really fine. The lawyer said, well, Biggie, I guess my work's done here. He said, all there's left to do is for you to pay me and I'll be on my way. Biggie said, I don't think so. What do you mean you don't think so? Did you hire me to do a job? He said, yes. Well, did I do the job? Oh, yes, you did fine. I really didn't think it would work. Well, then why won't you pay me? Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee. Diddly-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, diddly-dee-dee-dum. And that's the story of how Biggie Gallagher sold his cow. Now, you can decide whether Biggie was a wise man or a fool. Have a little sip of tea. Now, I thought, since we are a country with so much forested area, and I have such a tradition of spending time in the forest, camping, what have you, I thought I might share some stories that have been passed down that have to do with bears. Bears are a big part of my collection of stories, and I thought I'd tell you some personal stories, encounters I've had with bears. Although they're not an everyday occurrence, they do happen. So this story happened, I was probably about 13 years old, and I have to admit I wasn't very bright, as you'll see in this story. But I was out for a walk in the woods, and I was following a particular path, and all of a sudden, I came face to face with a bear. Now, I don't know what you know about bears, but there's a certain thing that they tell you that you should never, ever do when encountering a bear. And that is, you should never, ever run. But I did mention I was 13 years old, not very bright. And what did I do? I started to run. But I don't want you to misunderstand. I wasn't running away from the bear. You see, that bear, he started to run, and so I started chasing him. I had no idea what I was going to do if I ever caught him, but I just started chasing after him. Now, your average black bear is pretty fast. They certainly can outrun a human if they want to. But this poor bear, he was running ahead of me, and he kept looking over his shoulder to see if I was catching up with him, which meant that I was catching up with him. And I was getting closer and closer and closer. Now, did I mention that I was 13 years old and not very bright? Okay. I was not too far from that bear, not a clue what I was going to do should I catch him, when all of a sudden he changed his strategy. All of a sudden he came to a birch tree. Now, I don't know if there are birch trees in your areas. Birch trees are hardwood, and they have a bark on it. It's a lot like paper. Just kind of strip it right off. And that bear, he climbed right up into the tree, and there he was, sitting on the branch, looking down at me, almost as if he was smiling at me, as if to say, what are you going to do now? Now, did I mention that I was 13 years old, not very bright? I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a lighter and I stripped some of that birch bark off and I lit it on fire, and the fire just went right up that tree, burnt that poor bear in the butt, and he jumped out of the tree and took off running. Now, I'd like to say that that's where the story ended, but it's not. You see, about a week later, I was out in the woods again. I was in a different area, and I came face to face with a bear. And it was the same bear, and I knew it was the same bear because he still had that little bit of a charred backside on him. And all of a sudden, we started running again. Only this time, Mr. Bear was chasing me. Now, I told you, a bear is fast. And that, combined with the fact that I was now looking over my shoulder to see if he was going to catch me, meant that he was getting closer and closer and closer. I didn't know what I was going to do. And all of a sudden, there was a twist in the path. And just as I went around that bend, I saw a birch tree with a low hanging branch. And I reached up and I grabbed that branch and I pulled myself up into the tree. That bear was so close that I felt his claw scrape across the bottom of my shoe. Well, there I was up in the tree looking down at the bear, him looking up at me. Did I mention that I was 13? Yeah, okay. Looking down at that bear, I said, "What are you going to do now, Mr. Bear?" Well, all of a sudden, he just reached into his pocket, pulled out a lighter, pulled some of that birch off, and up that went. I got a burn on my backside. I jumped out of the tree, and I never saw that bear again. Well, I've been telling this story long enough that I know that there are some of you who doubt the veracity of this tale. Well, you might be right. But the event did occur and might not have gone exactly the way I just described. Maybe you'd like to hear what really happened. All right, I'm going to tell you. What really happened was I was walking along in the forest, and all of a sudden, I did come face to face with a bear. And I did start running, and I was not running after that bear. I was running away from him. And of course, true to his nature, he started running after me. Now, I'm not lying when I say a bear is very fast, and he was going to catch me. I could see he was catching up with me. I wasn't going to climb a tree. I know bears can climb trees. I had no idea how I was going to escape. I could see he was getting closer and closer and closer. I didn't know what I was going to do. Well, all of a sudden, an idea popped into my mind. See, about a week earlier, I'd been watching the National Geographic, and they were talking about sharks. And they said that if you're in the water and a shark's around you, you just have to hit him as hard as you can in the nose, and it really bothers them, and he'll leave you alone. And I thought, well, if that will work for a shark, imagine what it'll do to a bear. So my plan was, I was going to wait till he was a couple of meters from me. Then I was just going to stop cold, turn around, and I was going to punch him in the nose, and he'd be coming the other way. So the combined forces, I figured I'd knock him out. I might even kill him. Did I mention that I was 13 years old and not very brave? Well, that was my plan. And that's exactly what happened. The bear, he was about about 6 feet away from me, I think. And I turned around and I just let the punch fly. And he was coming right at me. Now, they say that when your life is in danger, time slows down. And I can tell you from this one incident that that's true. Because I watched in slow motion as my hand went towards that bear. And the bear didn't know the plan. It wasn't his fault. As my fist got close to his face, his mouth opened and my hand went inside his mouth. I could feel the hot breath on my hand. I could feel the texture of the tongue as my fist went into his mouth. And I knew the moment I pulled back, he was going to bite my arm right off. Well, what could I do? I had to think quick, and I came up with a plan. I figured, I'll just keep going. I pushed my fist all the way down through his gut. I grabbed his tail from the inside and I pulled him inside out, and there that bear ran off the other way. Insides out and outsides in. Now, some people doubt the veracity of that tale, but they say up around the Miramichi River, there's a bear with his insides on his outside. And I like to think that that's the same bear that I saw all those years ago. That's a tale you can believe or not to believe. as you see fit. Well, you know, we make light of all the fun times that we have in the forest and everything, but I want you to know that living in the forest can be very difficult also. There are sometimes some challenging situations. So I'm going to tell you a story. This is a story that most people believe to be true. I wasn't there, so I can't speak to the truth of it, but you can decide for yourself once you hear it. Now, this tale happened at the earlier part of the 19th century on a place called the Dungarvan River. And the Dungarvan is one of the tributary rivers that are all interlocking that eventually flow into the Miramichi River. And back then, it wasn't fishing. The Miramichi is best known for it's probably the world's best salmon fishing river, but this is not a fish tale. This is a tale about an industry that was very, very important in the earlier part of the 19th century, and that was the lumbering industry. And all along the rivers of New Brunswick, you would find lumber camps where the men would go and spend their winters cutting down trees, and in the spring they would haul the trees down to the rivers, and the logs would follow the rivers down to the mills that would catch these logs and saw them up and turn them into timber, into lumber. Now, this tale takes place in a particular lumber camp on the Dungarvan River, and it involves a young cook. Now, the only name that history remembers of this young cook is the name Ryan. And Ryan was a very popular man amongst all the lumbermen for a few reasons. One, he knew his way around the kitchen. He could cook up a meal, and so the men were always happy with Ryan in the kitchen because he made great meals. They also liked him because he was good-natured. He had a great singing voice, and he would often be heard singing while he was cooking, and he was always cheerful. And perhaps most importantly, Ryan had the best hoop in the entire lumber camp. Now, the hoop is the yell that the men will let out, and that's an important thing in the woods where the trees will block the sound so it doesn't carry far. So the louder your hoop, well, the further your sound carries. And that's a prized skill amongst lumbermen, so Ryan was respected for that. Now, the common practice of the day was the men would go out, camp, and they cut their trees and everything, then they'd make their way back to camp, and Ryan would feed them supper, and then they'd spend their evenings chatting or gambling. And well, Ryan, as friendly as he was, never took part in the gambling. He was always saving his money. In fact, he kept a money belt around his pocket, just hanging off his belt. And the reason he was saving his money, they say, was that he had a mother who was sick back home, and all that money he was saving for the doctor to pay for her treatment. So the tradition was that in the morning, Ryan would wake up, get the wood stove going, get the fire going, get the cabin nice and warm, and he'd make breakfast for the men. And when the breakfast was ready, he'd let out his hoop. And they didn't mind being woken to that hoop because it meant they had a great breakfast waiting for them. And while they were eating their breakfast, he would finish up making their lunches, their bag lunches, because they'd be out for the entire day. And in the late afternoon, early evening, when the sun was starting to come down, Ryan, after he had supper prepared, would walk over to the tree line, and he'd let out a loud hoop. And when those men heard that hoop, they knew that it meant it was supper time. So they looked forward to hearing Ryan. Well, this story takes place one particular morning when everybody got up as they usually would, with the exception of one man. That was the camp boss. Now, he claimed he wasn't feeling well, and he thought he'd best stay in bed and sleep off whatever bug was bothering him, and he'd return to the woods the next day. Well, the men didn't mind. I mean, imagine having a day of work where the boss isn't looking over your shoulder. So they were just as happy to leave him behind. So they ate their breakfast. Ryan handed them their bag lunches, and off they went into the woods to cut the lumber. Well, evening came. Sun was starting to hit the horizon, and they were waiting for that hoop. It didn't come. That was strange. Ryan was usually pretty good about keeping that hoop nice and loud so they could hear. And I thought, well, maybe we missed it, or maybe he simply forgot. But as the sun went down, hoop or no hoop, they knew it was time to end the day's work and head back to camp. So they did. They headed back. And rather than being greeted by a smiling Ryan waiting to serve them their supper, they found him lying on the ground, bloodied, dead. They found the camp boss and they asked him what happened. And the camp boss explained that it was a bear that had come in and had attacked Ryan, and well, he himself had barely escaped with his life. Well, the men weren't going to argue with the camp boss. On the other hand, the fact that the bear attacked Ryan didn't explain the fact that that money belt was missing. Well, there was no supper that night, and it didn't matter because none of the men really felt like eating. They just sat around quiet, thinking about Ryan and his last moments on earth. And eventually, they began to lay down in their bunks, and they couldn't sleep. It was very late, probably close to midnight, before the first of them started to doze off. And just as his eyes closed and he began to slip into slumber, there came a god-awful noise from outside, a blood-curdling, howling, whooping sound. They all knew what it was. It was Ryan. It was his last cry, a desperate plea for help, a hope to survive. Well, the men, they all ran to the windows. There was a full moon, and they could see just as clear everywhere in the camp, right out to the tree line. They couldn't see anything. There were no footprints in the snow. They all crawled back into bed. Not a one of them was going to sleep that night. They just lay there, and all through the night, there was that sound, that god-awful whooping sound off in the distance. They would just be relaxing of it, and it would come again. And the tension was so thick you could cut it. By morning, they were all exhausted. And they got up out of their bunks and they dressed warmly for the day, and they headed out the door. They weren't heading into the woods to cut any of the timber down. They were heading back to town. Not one of them was willing to work for that camp boss. Now, we don't know what happened to the camp boss. See, when the authorities made their way back to that camp, he was gone. Some people believe he took Ryan's money belt and ran off with it. There are others that believe that it was the Dungarvan Hooper, Ryan's ghost, that took him down. I'm not asking that you believe this story, but I will tell you this. Along the Dungarvan River, there's a stretch of forest that hasn't been touched in 100 years because no timberman will go anywhere near that forest for fear that they will run into the Dungarvan Hooper. And that's the story. A little more tea to wet the whistle. So I'm going to tell you a story now. Again, this one's from the French tradition. It's a story I came across when I was about 8 years old. And I remember I read it in a book, and I remembered it for years. And I hadn't heard it being told by anybody for many, many years. And I eventually was able to track down that book. And I have heard it told since by people, but it's a story I enjoy telling. And it involves a certain character by the name of Tante Odette. Now, Tante Odette was a very proud woman. She lived alone with her cat, Chou Chou. And she had a small farm just on the outskirts of town. And she would do all the work around the farm all by herself. And well, as independent as she wasn't necessarily the most skilled worker. So the farm was, a little troubled in areas, could use some extra work, but Tante Odette, she didn't ask her neighbors for help. She was too proud. Well, Tante Odette was a very tight-fisted woman. She didn't like to spend money. In fact, she would hold on to her money so much that she tended to eat the exact same thing for supper every night: cabbage soup. She would make the cabbage soup, and some people say that same pot of cabbage soup had been sitting on her stove for 10 years, that every day she'd add a little bit of water or some more cabbage, some salt, whatever was needed. And then, well, on Tuesday mornings, she would always make bread, and as the week went on, if the bread got stale, well, you just dip it in the cabbage soup, and it was just as tender as the day it was made. And this is what she and her cat Shoo Shoo would eat every day. Now, the custom was that Tante Odette would do whatever work was needed around the farm, and then in the evening, they would come down, and they would sit down at the table and have their supper, Shoo Shoo off to the side. And after supper, Tante Odette, she would go and sit beside the fireplace where she had a loom, and she'd begin to weave, and Shoo Shoo would lie there beside the fire, sometimes watching her, sometimes sleeping. Some nights, when it was really quiet, Tante Odette would say, Shoo Shoo, sometimes I really wish you could talk. It would make the evenings so much more pleasant. Well, one particular night, they had just finished supper. Tante Odette had just sat down at the loom when suddenly there was a knock at the door. And she went to the door and she opened it, and there stood a very colorful man. He was wearing a black jacket with a bright red sash around the waist. On his head, he had a big black toque, and on his face, he had a mustache that came into little curls on either end. The man bowed deeply. He said, "Good evening, madam. My name is Pierre Leblanc." He said, "I'm looking for a job. I'm getting a little old to be out in the woods trapping all winter or working in the lumber camps with the younger men. No, I'm looking for a small farm like this where I can, use these hands the way they were intended to be used. I can fix this place up." Tante Odette, she looked at this man. She said, "But I don't need any help. I do all the work by myself, me and my cat Shoo Shoo." And with that, she went to close the door. But this man, he was very fast, Pierre Leblanc. He stuck his foot into the door and he said, "Ah, yes, a very wise looking cat. Perhaps we should ask her." Tante Odette, "Don't be silly. Cats don't talk. Everybody knows that." Well, just then, the cat spoke. She said, "Tante Odette, let the man in. He looks honest. He looks like a hard worker." Well, Tante Odette couldn't believe her ears. Shoo Shoo was talking. And it's a rare thing for a cat to speak. So when one does, you should listen. And so Tante Odette, she opened up the door, and Pierre Leblanc, he came right in. Well, no sooner had he stepped across that threshold when Shoo Shoo spoke again. She said, "Tante Odette, Pierre Leblanc, he looks hungry. Give him some cabbage soup." Well, Tante Odette, she wasn't interested in sharing anything with anybody, but it's a rare thing for a cat to speak. And when one does, you should listen. And so she prepared a big bowl of cabbage soup for Pierre and gave him some stale bread to dip in the soup. And well, he ate it up. It's like he hadn't eaten in days. And no sooner had he taken that last bite when Shoo Shoo spoke again. She said, "Tante Odette, Pierre Leblanc, he looks tired. Give him a place to sleep." Well, this time she didn't hesitate. She went right up to the loft. She laid out a straw mattress for him, gave him some blankets, and well, it wasn't 3 or 4 minutes later, he was snoring soundly. Tante Odette, she came down and she picked up Shushu and began to pat her. She said, imagine, Shushu, all these years I've known you and I had no idea that you could speak. Well, it proved to be fortuitous that Tante Odette had hired Pierre Leblanc because, in fact, he was a very hard worker, and within a week's time, he had that farm in tip-top shape. And the very best thing was, he didn't mind eating cabbage soup and stale bread. Well, one night, he was just finishing his soup, and suddenly, Shushu spoke again. She said, Tante Odette, you know, Pierre Leblanc, he's a man. He needs meat pies. He needs strength to do all the work that he does. Tante Odette spoke to Shushu. She said, hey, I'm not giving him meat pies. Meat pies cost money. No, he'll eat cabbage soup. Shushu looked at Tante Odette. Money, money, money. What good is money? Can you eat money? Can you wear money? Can you burn money to keep warm? No. The only thing money is good for is to buy the things that you need. Give Pierre Leblanc a few coins. He'll go into town. He'll come back with all the things that you need. Trust him. Well, you know, it's a rare thing for a cat to speak. And when one does, you should listen. So, Tante Odette, she went to her little hiding place, found a few coins, gave them to Pierre Leblanc, and he went into town. And when he came back, he had all kinds of meats and sweets and other delicious treats, and a little sack of tobacco for himself on the side. Well, not really sure what happened, but over the next few days, Tante Odette seemed much lighter in spirit. She seemed much happier, and everything was going just fine. And then one day, a horse came riding up the road, and there was a man who looked remarkably like Pierre Leblanc. I mean, he had on the same black coat with the red sash, he had the black toque, but he even had the same curly mustache. And he approached Tante Odette, who was working out in the front, and she said, he said, excuse me, madam, is this where Pierre Leblanc lives? She said, yes, yes, this is the place. He's out in the forest right now, cutting firewood. He said, yes, but, you know, Pierre Leblanc, it's a common name. I know, the Pierre Leblanc I'm looking for, he looks very much like me, dressed the same way. She said, yes, yes, it's the same man. Still, Pierre Leblanc, it's such a common name. I know. The Pierre Leblanc that I'm looking for can throw his voice. What do you mean? Well, only 1 in 1,000 can do it, but Pierre, he can throw his voice so it sounds like it's coming out of a box or from behind a tree. You know, he can even make it sound as if somebody else is speaking. Tante Odette said, no, 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 it's not the same man. I wouldn't hire a man like that. I don't like witchcraft. Well, just then, who should come walking out of the forest but Pierre Leblanc? He saw his friend Jacques, and they embraced, and a few minutes later, they were sitting in Tante Odette's kitchen, drinking tea, catching up. Tante Odette was listening to them talk. She walked over to Shushu. She said, Shushu, I think I made a mistake. I think Pierre Leblanc is evil. Shushu looked at Tante Odette. Don't be silly, Tante Odette. The man's just kidding with you. Who ever heard of a man who could throw his voice? No, he's just making fun of you. Well, Tante Odette was so relieved. So she walked over, and she could hear Pierre's friend Jacques saying, come out to the forest, come trap with me all winter. And Pierre said, I don't know. And Tante Odette, she walked over, she said, are you thinking of leaving us? She said, you know, if you stay behind with Shushu and myself, you know, I might be able to give you a few coins from time to time. Pierre Leblanc, he looked at Tante Odette, he stood up and he bowed and he said, Madam, it would be my pleasure to stay here and work with you and your wonderful cat. And now I have some wood to cut. And so Jacques and Pierre, they made their way back into the woods where Pierre was finished cutting his firewood. And Tante Odette, She sighed, a great sigh of relief. And as for Shoo Shoo, she just sat there and she didn't say a thing. And that's the story of the talking cats. Well, I think I have time for maybe one more story. Now, I know that the story I'm about to tell is a story that is told all around the world. A lot of people know this story, but I love telling this story. I just think it's a lot of fun. So even though you may know the story, I hope you enjoy my take on it. It's a story that I tell about a friend of mine by the name of Chris. And Chris was traveling between Shediac and Moncton. Now, this was back in the early 80s. And back in those days in New Brunswick, the roads were horrible. They were filled with potholes and craters, and sometimes cars would disappear for days. And Chris had the great misfortune of hitting a pothole between Moncton and Shediac. And he happened to be out where there were no houses, no buildings around at all, and he hit the pothole and he got a flat tire. Well, that wasn't a problem because he had a tire to replace the flat one. He had a spare. But what he didn't have was a jack. For some reason, it had been taken out of the car. And so he was standing there thinking, well, I'm going to have to wait for a passing car. Then all of a sudden, a glint of light caught his eyes, and he looked up, and way up on the hill, he could see the corrugated metal roof of a barn. And where there's a barn, there's a farm. And where there's a farm, there's a farmer. And where there's a farmer, there's a solution to any problem. So he started to cross the field and make his way up that tall hill. And as he began walking up, he began to notice that there was an odor in the air. And the further up that hill he went, well, the stronger it got. The more offensive it got. It was really strong. And in fact, it was so offensive that had he not needed the jack, he would have turned around and gone back. But he really needed to fix that tire. So he continued up the hill until he got to the farm. And he walked up to the farmhouse and he knocked on the door. And when the door opened, there was a big burly man, big bushy beard and mustache. He said, "Can I help you?" And Chris explained the problem with the flat tire and the fact that he needed a jack. And the man said, "No problem, I have a jack in the back." He said, "I'm going to help you out." He said, "Give me a second, I'll find the jack, I'll drive you back down, we'll get your car up and going, and you'll be on your way." Well, Chris stood there at the door. While he was waiting, all he could think of was this offensive smell that it was overpowering. And all of a sudden, from around the side of the house came a small little herd of pigs. And he noticed that one of those pigs had a wooden leg, and he thought, okay, well, pigs, that explains the smell. But that wooden leg, that peg leg, that's very strange. So when the farmer came out, he said, "Excuse me, sir," he said, I just wonder if maybe you could tell me something about this pig. And he pointed at the pig with the peg leg. Farmer said, "Oh," he said, "I'll tell you about that there pig." He said, "That pig, last summer, my daughter was down at the river swimming. She shouldn't have been there alone. She knew that. She went into the water, and didn't she get herself into some trouble? Nobody there to save her except that there pig. That pig jumped into the water, grabbed her by the ponytail, pulled her to the shoreline, pulled her out of the water, gave her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, saved her life." Chris said, "That's remarkable. You're telling me the pig saved your daughter's life?" He said, "That's the most remarkable pig I've ever heard of." But you know, it still didn't explain that wooden leg. Chris said, "Well, tell me, farmer, is there nothing else you could tell me about this pig?" He said, "Oh, I'll tell you about that there pig." He said, "Last fall, my wife was driving that pig to the veterinarian. She had the pig in the back seat. As she was driving along, the car started to weave. She was feeling a bit of pain in her chest. She surely would have died, except for that there pig. That pig, he jumped from the back seat into the front. He got down and with his hoof, he hit the brake. With his shoulder, he clicked the car into park. He jumped out, flagged down a passing motorist. They called 911, saved her life. Chris said, that's remarkable. You're telling me that that pig saved your daughter's life and your wife's life. That's the most remarkable pig I've ever heard of. But you know, it still didn't explain that wooden leg. Said, farmer, is there nothing else you could tell me about that pig? Farmer said, oh, I'll tell you about that there pig. He said, you see my new corrugated metal roof up on the barn? He said, I put that up myself. He said, and I was up there and I was just finishing the job when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came a big rainstorm. The water was just pouring down, and didn't I slip? And I come flying down there. I was like I was on a water slide at a theme park. And all of a sudden, I was heading for the ground, and I surely would have died had it not been for that there pig. That pig had the presence of mind to run over, grab a wheelbarrow that was filled with straw. He pushed it with his body, pushed it right over to where I was about to land under that barn. I landed right in the wheelbarrow, filled with straw. I bounced right onto my feet, saved my life. Chris said, that's remarkable. You're telling me that that pig saved your life, saved your wife's life, and your daughter's life. That's the most remarkable pig I've ever heard of. But you know, it still didn't explain that wooden leg. Finally, Chris said, look, I don't mean to be rude, and if I'm stepping into an area that you don't want to talk about, I can appreciate that, but what I really want to understand is, why does the pig have a wooden leg? Farmer said, oh, he said that. He said, well, he said, a pig that remarkable, you wouldn't want us to eat them all at once, would you? That's the story of the peg-leg pig. Well, I think that's all the time I have for now. I really enjoyed sharing some stories with you, and I would encourage you to tune in to the World Storytelling Cafe from time to time, because there are all kinds of wonderful storytellers from all over the world who will share great stories with you. And if you want to pop something into the tip jar, well, that would be nice too. I'd like to wish you a good day, and hope to see you in person sometime. Bye now.
Did you enjoy that storyteller? Of course you did. And if you enjoyed it, like the minstrels of old, we're passing around the hat. And if you have some, whether it's paper or coin, our storytellers would appreciate what you put in. Every penny you put in goes directly to that storyteller through PayPal. All you have to do is go to worldstorytellingcafe.com. Click on today's stories or click on that storyteller, and there'll be a hat below the story. And you can just drop a little in that hat. Well, thank you for listening. And if you can afford it, we'd appreciate it.